This is the Solid Signal podcast for the week of March 15th, 2021, and the subject for this week is TV studios, who needs them? Now, I'm probably going to end up backtracking on that statement, but let me explain why I'm making it in the first place. In the last week, I happened to see two particular productions that made me think that the idea of the TV studio and the studio audience is something that we simply may not ever need again. The first was a fan film called Batman Dying is Easy. And I have to say, if you haven't seen this thing, you should probably give yourself half an hour and watch it. For something produced on a $100,000 budget, it's extraordinarily good. I will say the writing is a little bit more like a 60s drama than it is like something today. And there are some cases where the effects may seem a little bit raw compared to some of the things you've seen in theaters. But for a $100,000 budget, it's darn good, folks. The second was this week's installment of Last Week Tonight with John Oliver. This program has been produced, as far as I can tell, in Mr. Oliver's apartment for the last year, in front of a blank blue wall. As most television shows did, Last Week Tonight with John Oliver shut down in March of 2020 and came back in sort of a very limited sense with no studio audience and no studio. And that's the whole point that I'm trying to make. Whether it's something with tons of special effects and blockbuster video style stuff, or just a simple talk show, you can do an awful lot now with very little technology. I have to imagine that Last Week Tonight with John Oliver is shot with probably some sort of high-end prosumer camera, maybe not a completely video, digital video kind of thing, or that maybe because they may have that lying around. But at any rate, there's a lot of programs out there that are just shooting with phones and tablets or digital SLRs, and they do a great job. Put enough light in there and you really can't tell the difference. So it brings to mind the idea of, all of these production costs with all of the people attending to them, the fancy microphones and camera tripods and all that stuff that you associate with a studio-produced television show. Looking at something like Batman Dying is Easy, okay, so this is really what you would call a bottle episode. That other than one set on a rooftop, pretty much everything else takes place in more or less one room. And so that room is the only thing that needs to really be decorated. But honestly, the green screen work is excellent, the CGI work is excellent, and it just goes to show you can do an awful lot with stuff that you get at home. And people are doing it. The last time we saw something similar to this was in the writer's strike of about 15 years ago when, a lot of TV productions shut down and fan films took their place. And while the technology wasn't as good then, it was still pretty darn good. And I will say that there is some stuff from 2007, 2008 that still holds up today. The real question, though, is should television studio production come back? I'm going to say that I have a lot of friends who are in that world and who have been sidelined for a long time, and they'd hate to see that they were replaced by an iPad. But honestly, the work is very, very good. We have technology today that doesn't require, heavy-duty lighting and all of these really large pieces of equipment in order to make things work. And, even though the big news for this coming week is that we're going to see Zack Snyder's Justice League, which had something like a $100 million budget just for re-editing and new CGI. Most productions don't need that. I think most productions could probably make do with a lot less. It's all about using your creativity to try to put out really good work, despite the fact that you don't have a great budget. It can be done. Now, looking forward, I'm going to predict that these shows that produce right now without a studio audience or even without a studio are going to go back into a studio. They're going to start to employ some of these people who have been sidelined for a long time, and the shows themselves will look better for it. A lot of today's game shows are shooting without a studio audience. You look at something like The Masked Singer, which is using previously recorded studio audience footage, or something like Ellen's Game of Games, which as far as I can tell is shot without an audience at all, and they just kind of pipe in sound effects. And there is a little bit something missing from the immediacy here. You just don't have that reaction that a live audience gives you. But on the other hand, you've got shows, like I said, like Last Week Tonight with John Oliver, that are every bit as good as they would be if they were in a studio. Sure, I mean, you're not seeing some of these really big set pieces that you saw in years past, but it's not affecting the quality of the production. I think that Last Week Tonight will move back into a studio. I think they will all move back into a studio, and tentatively and slowly will introduce live audiences again. It's all part of getting back to normal. But as we look forward for the next, 5 to 10 years, how many of these shows are going to start, much more low key than they would have in the past? Yeah, the live audience is going to be a big component of a lot of it, but when you look at something like a newsroom set, how long is it going to be before we start seeing much, much smaller, much less intricate newsroom sets, because everything that you need can be done inside the computer and you don't need a big set for it? I think it's a move in the right direction. Even though I hate to see jobs lost to automation, it is something that is inevitable, and it's something that's going to help us in the long run. Looking forward at movies, I do think that movies will return to movie theaters. In a lot of the country, they already have, and you're going to start seeing more and more people feeling more comfortable being in a movie theater environment. But the days of the movie blockbuster that costs 500 or 600 million to produce, I think you're going to see fewer and fewer of those. Oh yeah, maybe, okay, Marvel Studios might still do it, or they might not, because honestly, you can do an awful lot of things, like I said, with a regular computer. But the days of that are probably gone, and I do expect movie budgets to shrink, and why not? Some of the best produced films of the last year have been ones that were produced on a shoestring with COVID restrictions, and they've been just as good. Low budget can be good, and in fact, the restrictions that you put on yourself when you don't have an unlimited budget do sometimes lead you to be more inventive. That's why I'm not worried about it at all. I think the world has changed. We're not ever going to go back to the way things were 100%. But when it comes to television productions, I think that is a good thing. That's about it for me on the Solid Signal podcast for the week. Be sure to like and subscribe and all of that great stuff. Leave comments wherever you can, because this level of engagement makes me look good to my bosses. Thanks again, and I'll see you next week.